Hey, it's Art from my new microphone. A big part of music production is maximizing the impact of our songs on the end listener. A big part of that is keeping things interesting and maintaining their attention throughout the entirety of the song. Keeping things interesting in our music production will enhance the replay value of our songs and even the connection that our listeners feel to our music. And so in this video, I have 11 tips that I'd like to share with you that I personally love using in my music production to keep things interesting and to keep listeners engaged. I will leave timestamps in the description box down below if you'd like to jump around to whatever speaks to you the most, or if you'd like to watch this video from start to end. I would greatly appreciate that, and I think that you'll dig it as well. So without further ado, let's hop into the digital audio workstation and get started. All right, here we are inside of Logic Pro, and the first tip I have to add interest to your music production is automation. Now, music itself is sound changing over time, and automation allows us to adjust different parameters within our music production sessions over time. And so it fits perfectly into music, making things more dynamic, more interesting, and at the end of the day, more professional in our mix. So in Logic Pro, the hotkey to open up our automation lanes is A, and you can see here, if I scroll through, we have a little bit of automation going on. Not a crazy amount. There are some tracks that don't have any at all, but there is a decent amount of automation going on here. And we can use it in a multitude of different ways. For example, here in the guitar solo, I'm automating the volume just to keep that guitar solo at the forefront of the mix. But we can also use it to make elements smaller or larger within the mix. For example, if I scroll up, I believe I did this in this mix. We see here the drums have insert 3 bypassed. Insert 3 is this channel EQ, which has a low pass filter at 14.3 right here, 14,300 hertz. And so in this section of the song, I want it to pull the drums back a little bit in the mix and have them sit well underneath where the guitar solo is. And one way to push things further in the back is to reduce their high-end frequencies, because naturally that's how we hear sound. The high frequencies are absorbed by the air before they reach us, more so than the mid-range and the low frequencies. And so the drums are bright in this section right here and in this ending section, and then I push them back underneath the solo in this section right here between 33 and bar 66, I would say. I did the same thing if we scroll down with the auxiliary percussion down here. If we go down here, I actually automated the high cut frequency itself. And so if we were to click on this EQ over here, we would see that this automation actually moves it down rather than simply turning that EQ on. So if we had a quick listen here, saw that move right there, and then this one turn on. And it pushes the drums a little bit back, pushes the guitar solo, therefore, more forward within the mix. We can alter the tone and timbre of different instruments throughout the mix. Now, this is a mix session right here, and so I'm only dealing with audio. But for example, if I was to come down here, open a software instrument, let's go open up an instance of Extra Records Serum. I could go over here and quickly create something with this MIDI. I will just run a single note here. Zoom in on this section. I can loop that and actually make this longer. I'm trying to keep everything on one screen here. I apologize. And we can turn this down so it's not blowing our ears off. And then open up an automation lane. And what I like doing in Logic Pro is actually opening up the automation here, going to latch, and then as I'm playing whatever parameter I click within Serum, I can link that to the automation lane. And so for example, if I wanted to add another voice here in unison and adjust the detune over time, because I touch detune last, it should show up right here. And then I can actually draw this in manually or do it in real time. So let's go from absolutely no detune to maximum detune over this. And so we can do things like that to alter the tone, the timbre, and the overall sound of instruments. It's particularly effective in synthesized instruments where we have all of these controls, but we can also alter the tone utilizing effects like delays, reverbs, saturation, distortion, compression, EQ, and the like. We can also alter the pan of different instruments over time. For example, if I wanted to alter the panning of the guitar solo right here, I could do so. Perhaps I'll go into latch mode right here and do this in real time. And so I could do that if I wanted to. And because I was in latch mode, this actually recorded into the session itself. You can see this automation of the panning right there. I can also utilize it to trigger one-time events. I will actually Control Z to undo that pan automation there and move on to effects throws. And so, for example, these two guitars, I have the send 6 of these being automated from nothing up to unity and then back down to nothing. And if we open up the mixer quickly right here and go to these two tracks, we see that send number 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, is going to bus 19. Bus 19 is the guitar verb throw, which is right here. I have the Space Designer right here with the old spring 2.2 second reverb with no dry signal there. And so I am not sending to that reverb for all of this time. And then just on this last few pieces of audio information in these guitars, I'm actually sending it to that reverb. So it will sound dry. And then just for these last few notes, there will be reverb on it. So we can have a listen here. So you hear that spring reverb really coming in there. There is a bit of delay on the tracks themselves, but then the reverb can really be heard right there. And because I'm sending to it, I can bring this down and the information is still held within this reverb plugin over here. Additionally, I have a different style of sends in this case. If we go over here to the drums in the intro, I actually have the snare cannon right here, which in the mixer you can see is fed by bus 17. And then this snare bottom and snare top right here are both being sent to bus 17. But instead of sending them and then not sending them, I'm actually effectively muting and unmuting the snare cannon itself. And so this has a delay, a big reverb, some EQ, some saturation, some stereo widening, and the gain plugin right here. And so I'm constantly sending information to this effects return, and then I'm basically opening it up and then gating it off. And so that sounds a little something like this. So that really reverberant canon or canyon style reverb is just opened for this section right here. And then it's closed off so that the snares are a lot tighter. And then it comes in again right here. And I only have that for the intro, as you can see right here. And so this is just touching the surface with automation and what I used it for in this session. I do have a video going into detail about using automation in mixing and music production. I'll leave a link to that in the description box down below. The next tip I have for you to add interest to your music production is to think contrast. This is not only in the elements of the mix, but also in the overall dimensionality, the short-term dynamics, and the long-term dynamics. And so we want varying elements that contrast in terms of their timbre and use cases within the mix. For example, we can have a nice smooth vocal, and then the drums can provide a transient backbeat to the song. This is very much taken care of in the arrangement, and in most genres of music, there is plenty of contrast between the various elements. In terms of the dimensionality of the mix, we can't have loud without quiet, we can't have wide without narrow, we can't have tall without short, or deep without close. So for example, in the case of width in this mix, I really took a hybrid LCR approach. You can see that only a few elements are just panned slightly off center here, and then the majority of the elements are panned directly to the center, or hard left or hard right. So that gives me contrast between the narrow center elements, although some of those elements are stereo, and then the hard panned left and hard panned right elements as well. In terms of height, I already talked a little bit about pushing those drums back by taking out some of that high-end energy. And then in typical mix fashion, I do a lot of high-pass filtering. You can see, for example, if I opened up any random E channel strip right here, I have quite a bit of high-pass filtering. In this case, this is a shaker, so I pretty much max things out. But even if I go down to, say, a snare drum, I will open up that EQ, and you see that I'm high passing everything below 123. Of course, that's a gradual roll off, but I'm restricting the bandwidth of these signals in order to make room for the contrasting elements that actually have information that I want in the mix in both the low end and the high end. And of course, in terms of depth, I have some elements that have a lot less reverb and delay on them to bring them up front. And I also have a lot of elements that are louder than other ones to bring them closer to the listener. And then I have other elements that I'm pushing back. It's all, again, about a sense of contrast. And finally, in the case of short-term dynamics, we do want transient dynamic mixes. We don't want to flatten everything out by over-compressing, over-limiting, and having a dull, lifeless sounding mix. And then in terms of long-term dynamics, we don't want the same energy throughout the entirety of the song. We want to mix things up and have sections of high energy, low energy, and transitional periods as well within the music to maintain the listener's interest and get better results out of our music production. The next tip I have for you to add interest to your music production is to utilize one-time effects. These could be one-time riffs or transitions or special effects or ad-libs or anything that happens one time within the mix to kind of act as a hook and to catch listeners by surprise maybe, or to give repeating listeners something to hold on to within the mix. And so for example, in this song right here, I have one part right before the guitar solo where there's two hits that act as a transition out of the main riff into the chord progression for the solo to act upon. And so this part is right here. Right here. So that's a very basic example. It is a transition in the case of this song, but this again could be any special riff that only happens once, perhaps an intro or an outro, or it could be a special effect. Three tracks that come to mind immediately in the electronic genre are Flying Lotus's Zodiac shit. That would be at around 42 seconds into the song. There's a special one-time effect that happens there. J. Paul's BTSTU at 1:03, and then Zonderling, Tunnel Vision, the Don Diablo edit at 2 minutes and 25 seconds. I wanted to write those down in my notes so that I would get the timing right, but if you'd like to check those out, I won't put them in this video for risk of copyright strike, but I think that that's a good use of a sort of effect or special sound to give a one-time effect in the music. And personally, I almost wait for those sounds. They're kind of like Easter eggs, so to speak, in the songs. And it's just something special that after having listened to those songs so many times that I can kind of hold on to within the mix. I will leave links to those songs that I mentioned in the description box down below. The fourth tip I have for you is to keep things moving within the song to hold the interest of the listener. So music is a lot about repetition. However, we don't want things to be boring throughout the mix. And so even if we're using the common song structures where we'll have a verse, chorus, bridge, chorus, or whatever's popular in pop music these days, it's important to, within these sections, keep things interesting for the listener. This can be by adding new textures and new sonic elements as we move throughout the song, by using build-ups and breakdowns throughout the song and focusing on the long-term dynamics. But just to keep in mind that along with proper songwriting and arrangement, it is our jobs as music producers to keep the attention of the listener at the end of the day. And a good test I like for that is the skip and play test, I like to call it. It's where we will start the song and listen through and skip ahead about 15 seconds or so pretty regularly. And if we find that the song is sounding the same every time we skip ahead, then we may have some work to do in the music production, either in the songwriting, the arrangement, or the production itself, in order to make things a little bit more interesting. So if I was to do that in this song, we can just skip ahead through the whole thing and have a listen here. So this is a relatively short song. A lot of the songs on this record I did are very short, but you heard there that as I was skipping through, we were getting a lot of different sounds, a lot of different textures, and we could still hear that it is a cohesive piece of music, but there's a lot of different stuff that's going on. And the skip and play technique is a valuable technique that I like to use when producing music, just to help make sure that we aren't keeping things too monotonous throughout the entirety of the song. Also, it may or may not be our place in the particular music that we are working on, but it can be valuable to cut sections out of the song that aren't actually adding a lot to the song, especially if those sections are repeats of other sections in the song. So I know that songwriters and artists can be protective of the work that they've done, but sometimes it's worth at least considering cutting certain sections of the song if they aren't adding to the overall interest of the music. One other thing I really like doing in music production is having mini build-ups or mini breakdowns within sections. I actually heard this for the first time from one of my favorite EDM producers, Savant, where he said something along the lines of each section needs to build into the next section. And so in EDM, the buildup is a big part of many genres. And he explained to me that each section should be itself a buildup into the next one. And so I took that to heart, and we can do that with different transition effects like backward cymbals, or ramping things up, or adding new effects as we build throughout a section, and then either enhance those into the next section or bring them back if we want the next section to come down a little bit in energy. And so a good example of that in this song is in the very beginning. I do have some pitching up of the guitars right here. You can see that I'm using the Waves sound shifter right here on this distorted guitar to bring it up. This is admittedly not a great plugin to be using in real time. It's pretty laggy and very CPU intensive, but you can hear in this section that the guitars are constantly climbing throughout. And so this whole section is kind of building up. The second half has that quarter note clap in it. And then I cap off the section with that reverse cymbal right here. And then we go into the next section, which is actually at a lower energy. And so within this section itself, I'm building up into the next section, and then keeping long-term dynamics in mind, we drop the energy down and then build up again into the next section. If you're finding these tips insightful thus far, I would invite you to hit that like button. It really does help out small channels like this one on YouTube. I greatly appreciate that one. Thank you. Tip number 5 I have for you for increasing the interest in your music production is the use of ad-libs. Now, these are most commonly utilized in vocals, although we don't necessarily have to use them in vocals. They're often used in hip-hop to add extra energy and sonic interest to the vocal performance and to help emphasize different lines and different words within the performance. And so this is not a hip-hop song per se. This is actually a production session that I am working on, and there are a bunch of vocal ad-libs that you can see here. If I bring down the mixer, you can see the lead vocal right here, and then these are all ad-libs down here. And so we can use ad-libs often between the main vocal lines here in the spaces, as you can see, and even use special effects on the ad-libs themselves to add even more sonic interest. And so if I was just to play this back, you can hear the ad-libs alongside the lead vocal here.
When I'm feeling about things no more, I be writing stuff. That's a fact. Because I need a touch of psychosis in me.
That's not me asking for it.
Just simply stating the fact now.
Alright, get on with it.
Cause when I'm going about things no more, I be writing stuff.
What up with that? What up with that?
Because my feet, they get afraid of the river sea.
Maybe you don't. Maybe you don't.
And that's that river muse.
Okay, guys, one more time.
All around us.
And so you hear the vocal ad-libs there being playful alongside the lead vocal in the case of this song. But if I was to get rid of all of those ad-libs, we would just be left with a fairly stripped down lead vocal in the case of this song. And so when I was recording this with the artist, we thought that it was a very important part to have these vocal ad-libs in the song. And I think that it really helps push things forward and keep things interesting for the listener as well. You also heard partially in that demo that I just did the tip number 6 that I have for you, and that is selective doubling. And so the double tracking effect is when you would have an artist or musician perform their part once, record it, and then have them record the same thing as closely as possible a second time, record that, and then mix the two together. And the tiny differences in phase, if they are a really good musician, they should be really tight. The tiny differences in phase will give us a sound that is more deep, it is more wide, and overall has more character in the mix. And so doubling itself is a superb music production technique, but I much prefer adding selective doubling so that we can better emphasize certain parts of the music and of the performance, rather than as a sort of catch-all technique that we use 100% of the time on a specific element within the mix. And so in this case, we have some doubling going on. For example, in this line, the first half is not doubled, and then we do have doubling on the second half.
Because I need a touch of psychosis in me.
And then I have a bunch of special effects going on through that as well. If we open up the mixer right here, I have some pitch shifting going on, and then it's sent out to a few other buses for more effects processing. But if we zoom back out, there is another part in here that I wanted to show. That is the last line right here.
Maybe you don't. And that's that river muse.
Okay guys, one more time.
So a lot of the lead vocal in this verse is single tracked, and then the last two lines are doubled right here. This one has a octave drop on it, and then this one's more of a true double. And while the timing's a bit off, I felt it did add to the overall vibe of this song, which is more playful and loose. And so we can do that with true doubling, or we can use it with specific harmonies. So you heard here the octaves right here that were actually affected octaves. We also have this section in the verse where there is some harmony going on. If we had a listen back here, this is right after the last two lines that we heard. So I'll go from there.
That's that river muse.
Okay guys, one more time.
There's an ad lib.
All around us is the drug takers playing with the salt shakers, one is for all. Y'all thinking you're different.
You are all the same.
Define getting twisted.
Pull it, pass it.
Just the other day I found my BlackBerry and it said when I plugged it in that I was stuck on a dead sea.
So in this section, we added in the harmonies right here, 4-part harmony plus the lead vocal. And that too can be thought of selective doubling. In this case, we're actually quadrupling or quintupling, depending on how you want to look at it. But it's just to keep the interest of the listener throughout this entire verse. It's a pretty long one. The actual riff on the bass doesn't change. And so we wanted to get a lot of different stuff going on with the vocals, again, to make the song more interesting. And then in the last section of the verse right here, I actually went full doubling right here to, again, get a different character out of the voice and to add more interest to this vocal.
See, no need in being afraid. I give my phone number out to a stranger.
Yeah, there.
I tell him and he can call me day or night.
So not only is the vocal delivery a little bit more intense at this part, but I'm also utilizing that double tracking that I was talking about where I recorded it once, recorded it twice, and then mixed them together. All right, here we are in another session to talk about tip number 7, which is to take advantage of advanced music production techniques, but not to over-process with these techniques. I'm talking about things like stereo widening, sidechain compression, parallel processing, reverse reverbs, and whatever else may seem a little bit advanced. It can be tempting when we learn these techniques to overuse them in our mixes and our music production. And while they can be super powerful, they are often best utilized sparingly within the mix. And if we want to use them more aggressively, to only focus on a few elements within the mix to really help those elements stand out with these advanced techniques. So for example, in this mix, I have my parallel processing on my drums right here, my parallel compression. So I have over here, bus 11, I have all of my shells going in there. So my kicks and my snares in the case of this kit, they are all being bussed to 11. And over here, 11 has my parallel compression, which is my trusty SSL comp right here, and then the decapitator from Sound Toys. And so we can have a listen to what this sounds like. But I'm not overdoing it. I have it nice and subtle in the mix so that it's not overtaking the rest of the elements within the mix. Another parallel processing I'm using is my parallel saturation here. I'm actually using the little altar boy. I really enjoyed the drive on this, and I have the pitch turned up to 12. And so this is bus 19, and I'm sending this synthesizer right here through that, right in this section. Here's it without the parallel saturation. And here's it with. And so that's nice to get a little bit of extra tone out of there. Parallel processing may be considered an advanced technique. I don't personally consider it one, but I figured I would show you this tone shaping ability in this video. And then I've got just a little bit of sidechain compression, which isn't actually sidechain compression. It is the LFO tool from X4 Records, which gives that pumping effect. And I'm using this on the piano 2 right here. So if you have a listen to just that. So I do have some reverse effects going on there, and then some pumping. I'm reversing it, I'm pumping it a little bit, but I'm not going overboard, and this is just one element of many within the greater context of the mix. So this piano in the mix can be heard like this. So it's a pretty dense mix. You heard that I pushed the piano up so that we could hear it. but just a little bit of pumping helps add to the rhythm of this track, particularly where I do have those reverse effects happening within it. And so there's some advanced stuff going on. You don't necessarily hear the piano standing out, but it does add a lot of that texture and a lot of rhythm within the greater context of the mix. If we go back here and play the entire mix with and without the piano, we can hear it's lacking in the mix when I mute it, and then how it adds a little bit of texture and movement when I bring it back in. So without. So that is tip number 7 I have for you. And tip number 8 is one of my favorites, and that is layering your sounds. I particularly like doing this with drums, and I do this on almost all of my own productions, all of my own music. So right here I have my kit, and I can solo all of this for you and go to a part where the drums are playing. You hear that parallel compression right here. But then on top of that, I also have all of this percussion, and these are all samples that I've accumulated over my time. So we have some splash cymbals, some ride cymbals, some hats, some extra snares right here. So if I was to just solo these tracks quickly. And then to bring in the drums. And then I will bring the perks in and out. So I'm not exactly layering everything in here. I actually treat the percussion and the drums as 2 separate instruments, almost as if I have a percussionist and a drummer. But you can hear, particularly in the snare, that adding in these 3 snares right here on top of the more acoustic sounding snare over here can really help add a lot of character to that snare, to that upbeat in the mix. Without the snares. And then with the snare samples. And so I really like using this with percussion, but you can also use it with a bunch of other instruments as well. For example, we could layer a guitar line with a vocal line, we could layer a bass guitar with a bass synth, and we can harmonize between different instruments as well. Having 2 different instruments with different tones and timbres that we mix together can yield really interesting results when it comes to the overall tonality of those 2 instruments. And because of that, layering is a super useful music production technique, especially if we want to add a little something new to the sound of our mixes. Tip number 9 for adding more sonic interest to our music production is the use of distortion. If you know me, you know I love distortion, and I like using it on a lot of different things. Pretty much nothing is off limits when it comes to saturation and distortion in my music production. I will often utilize it on drums. I see here that I'm not actually using it in this mix, surprisingly. But if I scroll through here, you can see that I've got some Saturn going on this bass sub, for example. Let's hear what this has to do with the sound of the bass sub right here. Let's solo this without the saturation with the FabFilter Saturn 2. And then with. Helps beef it up a little bit there. I also have it on the percussion bus. If I was to solo this. Without it, with. Helps bring out that snare a little bit and adds a little bit more character. It does actually make things sound a little bit harsh because it is acting upon upper harmonics to begin with. However, I think in the grander context of the mix, everything else helps to bring down the brightness of the percussion. So I don't think it's a major deal in this mix. Just something to note as we were soloing the percussion right here. If we scroll over, I have guitar distorted right here, which has the disto tube right here. This is one from Arturia. And if I solo this and play it back. So some special effects there. That just helps make it cut through a little bit more in the grander context of the mix if I unsolo that. So really affected, and then I throw that distortion on the top of it just to help it cut through a little bit more. I already talked about the little altar boy. Let's see if I'm actually utilizing it for any drive. You see that it is maxed out on Guitar Disto 3 right here. And so in addition to that drive, I also have another instance of the tube culture right here. So if I solo this guitar, so really destroying the sound there if I turn both of those off. Pretty standard guitar sound if I turn them both on. Just adds a little bit of extra noise and character to that hit in the mix. And if I was to take you through the rest of this mix, or any of my other mixes for that matter, you'd see a lot of distortion on my stuff. In subtle cases, and you may be surprised how subtle things may be, it just adds a little bit of extra presence by adding a little bit of harmonic content to the signal. It also has a compression effect, and so if we have really different peak levels, it can help to reduce the dynamic range there and help with our overall headroom. And then at medium levels, we can really shape the tone of something, and then at even higher levels, we can destroy the audio signal and get really interesting effects with our individual tracks, subgroups, parallel processing, and effects returns within our music production and mixes. Tip number 10 I have for you is to utilize modulation in your music production and mixes. Modulation effects, there's a whole bunch of them, so rather than going through and trying to find instances of each of the styles of modulation effects in my mixes and music production, I figured I could just go here, open up an instrument. Let's go to the classic vintage electric piano and just investigate a few different modulation style effects. All right, so we have our E piano here. And let's go and try to find a chorus. I'll go up to Arturia. They have some really nice chorus plugins. Let's try the Juno 6 right here. There's a little bit of latency, but I'm not going to go into low latency mode because that would axe out these. Let's turn up the mix here. So compare that to just the E piano. And that's just one chorus plugin. If we had a look at the other one, the Dimension D, a little more subtle. This one I really like on bass guitars. That one's a little bit more subtle than the more aggressive settings on the Juno 6. On top of that, we have flanger. So let's actually continue with Arturia. I'll give them a big shout out here. How about that? Flanger BL20. And maybe we'll go to presets. Maybe we'll go extra wide fun. You hear how the sound is changing over time. That's essentially what modulation means. A lot of different stuff we can get with that. Another common one is phaser, and I believe Arturia has one for that as well, the Bitron. If I open this plugin up, you can kind of see what's going on. And you can hear how all of these effects can add interest to the simple E piano right here. That's it by itself. And while I may not go that intense with a phaser, it is an option for me if I wanted to put it on any of the tracks within my mix. Another one is tremolo. We can just go to the modulation tab right here and get a tremolo plugin. This is very similar and essentially what the aforementioned LFO tool from X4 Records did, but this is basically amplitude modulation at a slow rate, an LFO rate. We even have ring modulation. I just picked up this nice one from Moog that I've really been enjoying playing guitar into. We can also have a listen to it with the E-piano. Ring modulation is not a very common effect. It's kind of strange, but I like strange and I like this plugin right here. We can switch from high frequency to low frequency to get more of an amplitude modulation or tremolo style effect. Or we can get into those audio frequencies and actually split the frequencies. I have an article going into detail on what ring modulation and all of these other modulation effects are. I'll leave links to each of those if you're interested in the description box down below. They're a little bit heady to get around, but I think that they do a great job explaining the science behind all of these effects. And we can, of course, go to high and then get the real ring mod effect, which may be a little harsh on the ears. But there's a whole bunch of different modulation effects that we can choose from to help change the sound over time and just add a little bit more sonic interest to our individual elements, our effects returns, and our subgroups within our mixes and music production. And tip number 11 for increasing the interest of your music production, I would rather just talk to you about, and that is to improve the overall separation of elements within your mixes. This can be done by avoiding frequency masking with things like EQ, sidechain compression, panning, making things wide, and having every element of the mix kind of stand on its own within the mix while still making it all sound cohesive if possible. And doing so will allow the listener at any point to focus on what they are primarily interested in the music at that given point without having a massive cluttering of all of the elements within the music. And so if we can think contrast when we are mixing, when we are actually producing the music, when we're writing the music, and also when we are arranging and choosing sounds for our music, I think the overall sonic interest of our work will be that much better for it. So this ties into what I was saying earlier about contrast. If we want separation, we want things to be deep and other things to be close. We want things to be wide and other things to be narrow. We want some things to be loud and others to be quiet. And just thinking of that overall contrast to help with the separation and therefore the interest of our mixes and music production. So that's what I've got for you inside of Logic Pro today. All right, I hope that those 11 music production techniques have proved insightful and helpful for you. And if you have any to add to the conversation, I would highly encourage you to let me know in the comment section down below. I'd love to get a discussion started and to learn what you guys like using in your own music production to add interest to your sound. If you like this video, I would invite you to hit that like button and also to subscribe here to the Mighty Microphone YouTube channel where I talk more about music production and mixing. If you'd like to learn more about mixing, I do have a free mixing guidebook. It will be the first link in the description box down below. You can sign up to my newsletter and I will send it to you right away. And if you would like to spend more time here with me on YouTube, there's another few videos in the top left and right corner that you can check out. So I hope to see you soon, and until next time, cheers.